Welcome to the Raw Rugby League podcast. I'm Meehall Wood, and we've got a very important question on the table today. We love first grade, we love second grade, we love third grade, we love kids footy, but how do you get through the process? Well, there's only one person to speak to for this. Now, I am the son of a development coach, this has been mentioned before, and I've got one of my favourite development coaches who I think I've been corresponding with through podcasting, journalism, etc. for almost a decade now. He has gone from being a PE teacher to, we've counted this out, the Raiders, the Panthers, Manly, the Tigers, and Mounties. He's currently the New South Wales Cup Coach at the Canberra Raiders. He's also the host of the excellent fifth and last podcast. It is Brock Shepperd. Hello, Brock.
How are you, Mike?
I'm excellent, especially because your Raiders drew with my New South Wales the weekend, which is better than I expected.
Yeah, I wasn't overly impressed with the result, but we move on. It's always I think I said to someone on Sunday, like, it's interesting how, like, our expectations are probably higher than, normal, because you walk out of Henson Park with a draw disappointed, whereas, all things being equal, it's not an easy place to play. The Jets are always really good opposition. So to walk out of there with a draw, I think, like you said before, or off air, that it was probably a fair result. And it was. I think Jets probably played the better footy first half, and we probably played better footy for the majority of the second. But, it was entertaining for fans, but not for coaches. I'll give you the tip.
Well, as someone who was sat in the grandstand, it was definitely entertaining. So my $10 was well spent on getting into it.
Yeah.
So, right, there is a good question you've started us on there, because in your position, I think we're going to work, we're not going to go sort of front to back on this or back to front. We're just going to jump around and see where we get.
Yep.
But you are a New South Wales Cup coach, right? It's your first year doing it, but you were at Mounties previously. When Mick Potter went to the Bulldogs, you took over from him also in the New South Wales Cup. And you've mentioned before that when you're a New South Wales Cup coach, your first principle is create first graders rather than win New South Wales Cup games. So I'm interested to see how that breaks down on a day-to-day kind of basis, and where the game at the weekend fits in relation to the general development of the 20-25 blokes you've got in front of you.
Yeah, so I guess the term that I would use to best describe it is, how do you create an NRL player is the backward map. So you probably need to look at every player that you've got, every player that I've sort of got in New South Wales Cup. I need to look at what are their weapons, what are their areas for development, and then how do they get into first grade. So I've sort of got to project forward, and, the first grade coach will give you an idea based on, look, I want to see X, Y, and Z from this player. And then I guess you need to mix your development coaching in with trying to get results. And a lot of the time, I always say to people, because that's the most frequent question, right, is how do you produce first graders but also get results? And I believe they go hand in hand, because if you're developing players to be good enough or near good enough to play in the NRL, then that level of play is certainly good enough at New South Wales Cup level. The part where it becomes a little bit tricky is New South Wales Cup level involves a lot of individualised coaching, a lot of one-on-one coaching. The hard part there is to sometimes deal with, your whole team structure and philosophy for the week, or your game plan for the week. So, my sort of approach around that is to keep it as simple as possible, and then to try and intertwine the strengths of the players that you've got into your team game plan for that week, and then just to drive those little individualised areas within each player. So you can not only make them accountable for the performance of the team, but you can also make them accountable for, their individual performance.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because if you go, obviously you worked at Mounties as well. I'm a well-known Newtown Jets fan, and they've got half a roster of players who are only ever New South Wales Cup players. They're not contracted to anybody other than Newtown or Mounties. And then you've got the other players who, in Newtown's case, are contracted to Cronulla. Obviously, the equivalent of you who's in the Queensland Cup might have players, only 3 players out of 17 be from one team. And that kind of speaks to it, innit? Because your job, if it was to win New South Wales Cup games, it wouldn't be, it would be a lot more simple, but I don't think it'd be the same job, right?
No, of course not. Yeah, like when I was at Mounties, we only had one player dropping back each week. So we only had one player who was actually in an NRL system at Canterbury, because the year I took over was a year that Canterbury also put their own New South Wales Cup in. So we weren't actually getting a feed back. So that actually, a lot of people said to me, oh, that must have been really, really hard. But it was actually really easy, because for 3 sessions a week, I had my team, and we were just focusing on us, where the majority of New South Wales Cup teams who are within a club and within a system, I guess you'd say, a lot of the time they're running opposition shapes. They're helping to prepare the NRL team. They're not necessarily focused on their own performance and their own, I guess, game plan for the week. You probably only really get one session a week where you get a little bit of time to focus on yourself. So I guess that gives people a little bit of an insight into how, the different preparation. Whereas at Mounties, we were just, the whole week was review based on the game on the weekend. Then we were straight out onto the field onto what's next. Who are we playing this week? What are the things that we want to implement? So for what we lacked in terms of player quality, we probably made up a little bit in regards to preparation and training.
And yeah, you do see that a little bit, because I know I watch Newtown, and sometimes you feel like Newtown are a more cohesive team, but then you would get the other team might have just better players. Like I remember we won the minor premiership by drawing with the Bulldogs. We dropped back to Vita Pangai Jr. They had Paul Alamoy, he was about to go up, because the Bulldogs were very up and down. So if you played them, you might get a crap team one week and a brilliant team the next. Whereas Newtown, you kind of always knew Billy McGulius is going to play, and these sort of guys who were only ever Newtown players. And I wonder, especially for the development of your guys, because your guys are also being the opposed session, is that must help them in their development to have, Chevy Stewart, your fullback, to be like, okay, this week you're Reece Welsh and next week you're Latrell Mitchell, kind of
course,
hate what the other teams are going to do on an individual level.
Yeah. Yeah, and some weeks that's really difficult, right? Because Chevy Stewart isn't, he's got different strengths to Latrell, but, he's probably more similar to a Reece Walsh. So when they're trying to implement, I guess, attacking structures from those teams, it also teaches him to have different strings to his bow. This is what Latrell does. If it's uncomfortable, that's good, because it's challenging you in different areas to develop different areas of your game. So, and then he's also got those little focus areas that, we're driving really hard to say, these are the things that you really need to be doing well to be projected and be pushing for a first grade position. So
we're going to go straight back to the other end here, because you've obviously worked, as I mentioned, you worked in the PE system, going through the schools and stuff like that. And I think it's worth explaining for people who don't know, because I know there's a lot of people who just only care about the NRL and don't kind of understand the iceberg underneath. What is the pathway like in terms of levels from, I know, a 12-year-old who's brilliant going into high school to the NRL? Like, what stages does it take?
Yeah, so I started, my coaching background, I actually started at the mod level, which was under 9. So that's exclusively primary school kids who will play PWSA sport and your club footy on the weekend. The age group that you're shooting at, a lot of the kids will go into full international footy at around 12, 13. So sort of that age that you're talking about where they enter into high school as well. And then from there, it depends on obviously what high school you're in. So if you're in a combined high school, which is basically your local public, you've got, each of those schools will have their programs. Some have got, what they call TSPs, which is talented sports programs. So your Hill Sports High and your Westfield Sports High. And they play basically under the combined high school system, which is your CHS. So they'll play tournaments against each other. And then they'll also play Buckley Shield, University Shield, and then a lot of those teams are playing the GIO Cup. So those systems, I guess, are the school systems, and within those you'll have a lot of kids from different clubs. The other side of it is your CCC, your Catholic system, which is combined Catholic. They're very similar. So they'll play in an MCS, Metropolitan Catholic Schools competition, if you're in the Sydney region. And again, they'll play, that's your St Dominic's, your St Greg's, your Parramatta Maris, your Blacktown Patrician Brothers, your Fairfield Patrician Brothers. They play in a Catholic competition against each other. And then when they get into that, that open age level of high school football, they play in the GIO Cup where they're playing against each other. And they're very similar. So a lot of those schools or talented sports programs will have an affiliation to different clubs based generally on geographic location. So, traditionally St Dom's has been Blacktown Patrician Brothers and St Dominic's. Parramatta have had a strong affiliation with Westfields and Hill Sports High, as have Canterbury. Endeavour Sports High have had a long association with Cronulla. So a lot of the time when NRL clubs bring in players, targeted players, they'll put them at those schools to not only have them play Harold Matthews or SG Ball, but also to have them coached within those programs, which are local in terms of geographics, but they probably also have, a PE teacher like myself who is in those lower grade teams, but is also running the rugby league program as well. So I guess to answer your question, like if they're under 12s and they're entering into high school and they're a talented player, they'll probably go to one of those schools if they're in the Sydney region. And then the NRL clubs would have, development squad programs or, elite squad programs where they're probably training one night a week with a development coach from their NRL club in their specific geographic region. And I guess, that year 7, 8, 9 and 10, you're just trying to develop a player to prepare them for Harold Matthews footy, essentially. And then once they play Harold Matthews, you're then trying to prepare them then for, how do we then create them or push them into an SG Ball system and essentially just run up the ladder. And then where it gets a little bit different is when they finish high school, because then obviously they're eligible for full-time training. And that's where a lot of the agitation at the moment for, you could probably look at the West Tigers as a good example because they've had a lot of good results in their junior rep programs and they've got a lot of really good young kids. Their NRL have struggled a little bit over the last few years, like everyone knows. So there's always that little bit of agitation for these guys to say, well, yeah, these are our next best players, or this is our next crop of NRL players. And a lot of those guys are shooting for top 30 and full-time training sooner rather than later. And that's where I think there's a lot of challenges for clubs at the moment because they're probably thinking, well, we want to keep this kid, but is he ready to train with the NRL physically and in terms of his development as a player?
Yeah, it's interesting for me because I've gone through this whole system on the other side of the world, and it is very different how it works in terms of we don't have these. You have I think of De La Salle in Wigan or St John Fisher. These are like famous schools for it, but it's not. They're more because everyone in Wigan loves rugby league, and therefore these are the big schools. Yeah. It's not like you would go to, my school would have been the best school you could have gone to play rugby league, but that was just a coincidence. It wasn't. If you went to the next school down the way, you might have only had 2 players who were any good, and the rest were just forced to be there. Whereas on the other hand, if you went to soccer, it would have been completely different. And I think there's something in trying to find kids who are as good as the other kids, if that makes any sense. Because one of the things that you notice, playing, watching junior footy is that up until the age of 16, it is a lot of the time who's the biggest kid. Which, and I wonder from a coaching perspective, how do you identify how, this kid is small but going to be good, and this kid is big at the moment but doesn't fancy it, and when everybody else is big, he won't be very good. Is that something that you're, as a PE teacher, I'm sure the scouts come and talk to you and say, who are the best kids? It's a difficult skill to identify who's going to be good in 5 years' time, but that's kind of, I wonder if there are any tells or anything like that that you would look for.
Yeah, I think that comes back to your recruitment philosophy at your NRL club. And, are you somewhere where you are having to recruit your development players, or are you somewhere where you're developing your players? So if you've got a big junior crop, a junior nursery, then I guess you've got a little bit of control over how you develop your players. And, you can sort of stream them, I guess, in relation to, okay, these are the type of kids that we want in our Harold Matthews because these are the types of kids who we think are going to project forward into NRL players. And then there's probably the other side of it where you've got clubs who don't have that big, strong junior base who then have to then go and pick and choose players based around what they want and what fits their recruitment or their head coach's philosophy around what an NRL player is going to look like. But I think generally you're looking probably for a little bit of both. Like your physically dominant kid at 15, 16, I think they should always be rewarded and they should always play at that level because they are dominant at that level. And it's probably twofold. You need to, a lot of the time what happens at that age is those players don't get challenged because, how do you challenge a kid who's just killing it at that level? But if you've got the mindset in and around, well, hey mate, I'm trying to get you to the next level, and with a mindset that we're going to develop you through to hopefully the highest level, you get a little bit of buy-in. Or the other side of it is when if you're in one of those areas which is a little bit weaker in relation to having those dominant players, because you can always go through your Harold Matthews and, that level of competition in Queensland where you're going to see those areas that have those physically strong, dominant players. But if you then look at does the dominance and the results at that junior level or that, sort of 15s to 19s competitions, does that translate into NRL success? And a lot of the time, it doesn't. I guess Penrith are probably the outlier there at the moment because, they're pretty dominant, or they have been pretty dominant in most grades. But even if you look at their results this year, they didn't make the finals in Harold Matthews or SG Ball. So that's not to say that they don't have very good juniors and very good players there, but, their recruitment philosophy at the moment might be a little bit different because they're thinking, well, we've got a long-term halfback, we've got long-term front rowers, we've got long-term fullback. So that the type of player that they've got in their Harold Matthews and SG Ball may have changed a little bit based on what they're trying to produce. Whereas other clubs, beggars can't be choosers. So in a way, they've sort of got to take what's there and take what's available and then try and develop it into what, hopefully be a first grader. So I think it changes based on club, head coach, and then geographics, and then who you've got running your junior recruitment and your junior development. And I've been at 3 or 4 different clubs and seen 3 or 4 different approaches and 3 or 4 different talent pools. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. That's we could go 2 hours on that, just with how many different layers there are. But I think essentially, Mike, you're trying to develop both. You're trying to push the dominant and talented kid, but you're also trying to identify habits, traits, skills, and abilities that you can see projecting into the next grade or projecting forward into senior footy.
Yeah, you mentioned just there's something that sort of brings me on to my next question, which is about, I hate the idea of thinking of 13-year-olds as having a mentality, right? But the kid who's incredibly talented, for example, who I think of when I was growing up, you play junior reps and stuff like that. I played in a group that had me playing 6 with Richie Myler, Sam Tompkins, and Kyle Eastford, who all went on to play for England, right? And you could see at that level, under 14s, under 15s, that these kids were way better than everybody else. But they weren't all. Sam Tompkins was on a next level better than anybody you'd ever seen at that age. But he wasn't. The others who played for England weren't like the standout best player on the team. There was other kids who were very good, but didn't have the mentality, didn't fancy it, had a different family background that maybe came into the way. And I wonder what you obviously you're a coach, but you're also a teacher. You're also you deal with the parents. You must have to have all that other stuff about the individual in front of you from a sort of pastoral level about what, are there things that aren't to do with this kid that is going to factor into the ability to make it? And I wonder how much that factors in, because for you as a development coach, you're dealing with the person, but for the West Tigers or the Penrith Panthers, they're dealing with the Penrith Panthers. They just want the kid who's going to be best. And that's sort of the line that you have to straddle.
Yeah, I think that that's changed a lot, in relation to the game's philosophy in and around welfare, mental health, looking after players. So I think the players have never been more looked after, and I think there's really good processes in place for the kids who don't necessarily make it. They have exit strategies and they have meetings with the players that, if a player gets told, look, mate, say for example now, your Harold Matthews and your SG Ball are finishing up, probably more for your SG Ball guys. There might be SG Ball guys there who have been on contract with a club, for 2 or 3 years. It comes the end of the SG Ball when they're on age, so they can no longer play SG Ball next year. And the club might come to them and say, look, we're not going to renew your contract for next year. So therefore your time with this club is done. Now, that's not to say that they're not going to get an opportunity somewhere else, but how that's dealt with and how that's administered and how that's the process and procedure in and around that is pretty stringent, to try and not only give the player the feedback in regards to these are the things in your game that we think you need to improve, and then it'll be, employment, if that player has actually moved to that club, because a lot of players, they're moving from Queensland or vice versa, they've moved from New South Wales to Queensland. So trying to assist them to, move back home. You've also got issues such as partners. You've got issues such as tertiary education, TAFE, all those different type of things that intertwine into these guys that are, can be coming off contract and not have that opportunity. So there's a whole heap of little intricacies that you need to work through. But yeah, I think connection's really important. Like as a coach, if you can get your players to trust you, you have a lot of those issues you can iron out, because you then build a rapport and the player begins to trust you. And then you can have those conversations in and around trying to drive those little attributes within their game. It may be that they're a little bit ill-disciplined. It may be that they're not physical enough. It may be that they don't talk enough on the field, we're talking. But there may be reasons why that's happening which are not related to anything to do with on the field. It may be because, there is something going on at home, or they don't feel confident doing it. They may have had a negative experience in the past in a certain position or with a certain coach. So I guess it's sort of trying to work out whether it is a behavioural problem or there's something a little bit deeper, and then trying to use your influence once you've built trust and a connection with a player to try and assist them to, build on those attributes or add those attributes to their game. But it's an interesting question. I think people would be surprised how frequent it is across all grades, just trying to, drive those little things and those little behaviours, because they do make a massive difference, and they certainly help with how a club functions. Because if you can assist not only the footballer but the person, it certainly makes cohesion and having a happy club a lot easier.
The thing that jumps to mind is I can't remember which, I think it was West Coast Eagles AFL coach. He basically said he wouldn't sign players, obviously in the AFL, who didn't go to a private school, because it was the classic rugby union, he comes from a good family kind of nonsense, as if people who didn't go to expensive schools didn't have good families. But he was basically saying that his job wasn't to deal with all the external stuff that comes from, people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Again, as if rich people didn't have difficult families at times too.
Yeah.
But I feel like that's something which, on this podcast we spoke to Joe Nullifar about, who was doing the Pacific Pathways at the Panthers, now works at the RLPA, and stuff like that, where you're dealing, for example, at the Panthers or the West Tigers, you're dealing with like a huge Polynesian community who with different values, different familial structures to what the other kids have got, or what kids would have had, most of the kids would have had 20 years ago. Like, you're kind of at the forefront of that and navigating all these different things which have changed over time, probably in the time that you've been doing it as well. And I know being at Canberra now, where you would have a lot of country boys as opposed to city boys, it's going to be different. Or, I've spoke to Dean Widders in the past about kids coming in from Indigenous communities who would have the football talent, but suddenly they don't know anybody, and they're smaller than all these Samoan kids because their bodies develop at different rates, and that's something that's up to you as the coach to kind of juggle, right?
Yeah, and I know, probably going back to my days as a teacher running a rugby league program, a lot of the things we used to do were just life skills: bank account, tax file number, driver's license, L's, P's. Because if we had kids there who would be offered opportunities to go and train and play with NRL clubs, say, for example, the Roosters. There was a time there where the Roosters were doing a lot of recruitment in and around Western Sydney, and, the boys wouldn't have the capacity to get there. So straight away, that opportunity and that door closes, just because, not because they're not talented enough, but just because they don't actually have the access or the ability to be able to get themselves to training. So we sort of identified that and then tried to upskill the kids within the program to try and make sure that, they could get part-time work so they could afford to get on a train, or, they had their P. So when they left school, if they were, offered an opportunity at Manly or the Roosters or South or someone, in that inner city basin, that they'd have the ability to go and take it on. Because, a lot of the time the players that we sort of had at Chifley College, we were a CHS-based team, or CHS-based school, but a lot of the top-end kids from that area would end up at Blacktown or Westfields or Hill Sports. So we were getting the players who weren't identified and given an opportunity with those programs. And a lot of the time those boys were able to access opportunities with Harold Matthews and SG Ball, but not locally. So that was sort of a barrier that we identified, and we tried to break that down to ensure that they could, go and get into and try and take advantage of some of those opportunities. But yeah, they're I guess some of the, scratching at the surface, some of the real basic challenges that some of our young players have in the game, not only in Western Sydney, but rugby league's it's a blue collar game. Like I know, I've spoken about on my podcast. Like my family were both, my parents were both. Neither of them finished school. My dad was a mechanic by trade. My mum was a hairdresser by trade. So, they were just hardworking people from Western Sydney, and all the guys that I've played footy with, or all the guys I've even come through coaching with. That's sort of the theme. Like that's the rugby league person, the rugby league player. Like that's that blue collar background. So yeah, it's interesting that they had that private school philosophy, but most of the time when we're talking about sporting ability, a lot of the time the people that are given opportunities even at private schools in Western Sydney, whether it be those private rugby union schools or the rugby league programs, it's not necessarily because of their intellect, it's because of their sporting ability. So that's probably one side of all this that gets ignored a little bit, in that I'm not sure we actually equip our students, like in year 11 and year 12, who get put into those programs. I don't think they get challenged enough in regards to their education. So they've got the tools and abilities to, if their rugby league career or rugby union career falls over, that they've actually got the tools to go and do something else. I think we probably have too big of a focus on, sport, whether it's union or league, and that becomes all encompassing, and we actually overlook upskilling them and giving them opportunities at even higher education or TAFE or whatever it is, to give them a skill which will make them employable if they don't become successful as an athlete, a professional athlete.
Yeah, I think that's a problem across all sports. I think of, growing up I was in the catchment area for Man United and Man City, and like the kids we must have had 5 kids from my school signed to Manchester United and Man City, one of whom became a professional footballer in the fourth for Rochdale, the local team, and the rest of them were just, whatever, see you later. And you think like they would never have got anything because Man United ultimately care about Man United and not about the kids. And that's totally changed now. That would have been obviously 20 years ago. But one of the sort of interesting ideas, just thinking of the sort of the divides of different methodologies on this, because I know that in France, and I think they do this in New Zealand Rugby Union as well, they separate their kids by weight, not by age. Yeah. And then I know I was once at a trial in Wales where all of the kids from Wales were split into North and South. This is in Rugby League, obviously. And instead of doing it year by year, they did it by half year. And the idea was to try and make the kids. And so this is a sort of 2-part question about how the sort of pedagogical, I can never say that word, pedagogy result, where you try and get in kids the same size as them, because theoretically then they should be able to, the skills should develop equally, and you'd be able to see the better players without having the obvious problem that some kids are bigger than others when they're 14 because of when they hit puberty. And I wonder if that's something you've come into contact with, or if you've got any sort of ideas on that, because it would seem to me, if you've got, I don't want to sort of return back to the Polynesian thing, but obviously Polynesian people are very large earlier than other kids are, which I would imagine distort who was actually good at footy. Not to say the Polynesians are obviously amazing at footy, but that would be something that would factor in. And I wonder if you've ever come across stuff like this in terms of trying to get kids in with kids the same size or roughly the same age, because the difference between 12 months between a 14-year-old who's born on the 1st of January and one who's born on the 31st of December is massive.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it, but recently I really have, because my wife went to sign up a young fella, like he turned 4 in January. Now, one of the people at this registration said, "Oh, your son's a January boy. Like, oh, he's going to be really, really dominant." And my wife came home; she had no idea what they were talking about, like why being born in January would be such an advantage. But once I sort of told her, and our daughter, she's born on the 28th of December. So like I sort of laid it out to her, I think it eventually made sense that, you can be 3 days apart, but, in 2 different age groups. So I know in America, like I probably look at America when we're talking about long-term athlete development, and then like you're talking about like pedagogy and the approach from the sport in relation to development. Weight for age got pushed really heavily in the Penrith area prior to COVID. Like I don't think it's been pushed as hard there at the moment, and a lot of that was from those parents who were saying, my son or my daughter, they're struggling in the game because they're not physically big enough. And I think the NRL are doing enough to create different avenues into the sport to try and keep people participating. But I guess, whether this is a twofold in relation to what's the end goal here. Is the end goal to increase participation and have those people become long-term fans and participants in the game, and provide as many avenues as you want for that? And we do that, right? With touch, with OzTag, with, I guess the non-contact versions of our sport. But and then we've then got to look at and work out what is the best system to develop NRL players. And I guess it needs to be separated from, this is my opinion, I think if you look in America, they split their age groups in half years, like you're talking about. So it'd be, January 1 to June 30, and then July 1 to December 31 would be how I guess they would structure their competitions. I think the issue that we would have in a lot of areas at the moment is that I don't think they'd have the players to be able to do that within, like, creating subgroups. So, I think it's probably a valid approach, but it'd just be logistically how we would get it done and then keep the competitions as strong as they possibly could be. Because in theory, right, it should become more competitive, and physically there shouldn't be as much dominance, which are the things that you're trying to create. Because if you've got a more competitive competition, you're then developing more players, and you're not having, those super teams that they're talking about, in southeast Queensland and in Western Sydney, where you've got, junior clubs who are sort of, I guess, recruiting almost to be that superior that they're whacking every team by 40 and 50 points. And, I know a lot of the parents who have kids in those teams think it's unreal that they're winning those games by 40 and 50. But again, you could look and go, okay, does that help them to project forward and become an NRL player? And I don't think it does. And on the flip side, I also think that it actually doesn't help the player that's just been smashed by 40 either. So I've actually did a little bit of study into a few NFL systems, and what they actually do is they take players away from junior club systems altogether. So, whatever the entry level is, and this is probably the best system that I've seen, and the system that I think would work best. It might have been Carolina that was doing this. They had obviously a strong junior development area for NFL players. They were then taking them in at 15. And what they were then doing was having, I guess, like a combine to rank the players. And then they were then drafting them behind closed doors and then just putting them in different coloured teams. So you'd have Carolina red, Carolina blue, Carolina green, Carolina yellow. And they would actually stream the teams to be as close as possible, with the idea that you are not only mixing these strong players in with your weaker players to hopefully, raise the water level collectively, but to also create a competitive level of competition every week. And I found that really interesting. I thought it'd be really, really beneficial. I also had a chat to my wife and I on our honeymoon, we watched the national championship, Clemson and Alabama, and I ran into a guy who was in the athletic department in soccer at the University of Alabama, and he was saying that they have a similar approach where they bring all their junior, I guess, college players or high school players who are going to come through their program, and they do exactly the same thing. They stream them, and then they try and create, 4 to 6 or 8 or however many teams are in those different competitions, try and make them as even as they possibly can to then ensure that they're challenged and they're getting competitive gameplay every week.
when the women's competition, Women's Super League started in England, they had this problem where St Helens, well, as it was actually, there was Thato Eve, which is a local amateur club, sort of a, powerhouse amateur club, just became St Helens. St Helens said, you can wear Saints jerseys and we'll give you some funding, blah, 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 and you're now called St Helens. But they had all the best players. And it got to the point where it was like, their players need to leave. Otherwise, the England national women's team was getting worse because St Helens were getting better, to the point where they just whacked everybody. And actually, it's improved massively because there was Leeds and Saints and Bradford were the best, and now they've split across, so Wigan have a better team, and York have a better team, and Castleford have a better team collectively. And they sort of had to make a conscious decision, which helped with professionalism because suddenly, they could buy players off each other. But that was the major issue. I'm just thinking of, weird questions that have occurred to me whilst I was thinking of what to ask yesterday. When I was a kid, remember David Waite? He coached Britain, he coached the Catalans, he coached St George over there.
St George, yeah, I think so, yeah.
So he was the coaching director. And one of the things I remember this is when I was in, 11, 12, 13, was that he was insistent that every player do everything. So on Saturday mornings, our junior club you'd have the prop forwards kicking, you'd have everybody doing absolutely everything. Because they thought, you might be a prop forward now, but if you don't grow at this rate or whatever, you might end up being a 5'8" or standoff, as we'd have called it, down the line, or you might become a loose forward who needs to pass. Is that something that you, at a junior level, you have to be aware of not streamlining players too much? Because I know that in one of our previous episodes, I spoke to Dr. David Lippman, who's a strength and conditioning guy, who was very big on the idea of transitioning players, with this S&C program to what their ideal weight to play in the NRL would be, and that what that looked like when they were 16 could be entirely different from when they're 30. If you get what I mean. And that's something that if you're going to go up or down, you're going to need to have different skills for it. So that must be something you really have to focus on across the board when they're very young.
Yeah, and that's even something at New South Wales Cup level. Like, you're sort of chatting to players like, well, if we're ranking you, if you're a middle or you're a lock or, and you've got the ability to then, maybe play some hooker or maybe play some back row or maybe be able to play a different position, it gives them more upside in relation to selection if the coach is looking for versatility and having multiple skills. So that probably then, mirrors back and relates to what you're talking about at the junior level. Now, I think predominantly the majority of junior coaches would not be even thinking about that. And I don't think that's their fault because, a lot of junior coaches are doing it to give the kids an opportunity and they're not necessarily in coaching to coach long term. And, I think from a junior level and at our grassroots level, we could never do too much for our coaches, like to help upskill our coaches, because in the end, they're kicking off and starting the wave in relation to the next crop of NRL players, and that's always the case. So I think, fundamentally we should be doing more in relation to, what at the top level are the things that we think are the core skills, attributes, abilities that create an NRL player or give someone the best possibility or chance to be an NRL player, and then how do we filter that down into how we coach our players at the grassroots level? I think that's probably, again, that term I used before, like just backwards map a little and work out what they are. But I did a little bit of this when I was coaching Mod League, only because when I was at Parramatta, I played under Brian Smith, and he was the same as David Waite. Like what you've just described there was a lot of our preseason sessions when Brian was the coach and I was playing Jersey Flag at Parramatta. Like we would do kicking every Friday, and that would be, I was a lock forward at the time, lock forward back rower. I kicked goals, but I never kicked in general play. But every player in the Jersey Flag squad would do kicking for 15 minutes on a Friday. For that reason, that if you're called on to put a kick on during the game, or you never know where you're going to end up in relation to position. So, the philosophy at the Eels at that point in time was just to upskill everyone as much as possible across every fundamental area of the game. That even went to dummy half passing, was a big one on both sides of the footy, because, the conversation was always, or the question was always asked, can you throw a good pass on both sides if you find yourself at dummy half? It could be the last play of the game or the most important play of the game. Our hookers run and got tackled. Can you throw a good, left to right or right to left from dummy half? Brian just had a philosophy that he was streaming through the club at that point in time where, all of those things were super important. But I guess going back to like the core of your question, I think the more exposure junior players can get in different positions, it's definitely going to add strings to their bow, whether or not, you think that long term they're going to be playing in that position. I think the more you can challenge players, put them in different situations and give them different cracks at different positions, the more well-rounded and holistic a player you're going to develop. But, whether the coaches have the skills to be able to create environments where that happens, or whether their mindset is around development and not results, I guess that's probably why we're looking at the implementation of non-competitive competitions in New South Wales and Queensland. I know that's met a lot of resistance, but I can sort of see that. I don't like it. Like, I don't like non-competitive, but I sort of understand why it's gone down that avenue. Probably going back to what I said earlier about clubs and coaches and certain teams trying to create super teams, and how do we alleviate that and have development as the prime focus, not result. The more that we can push that, the more that then development is going to be at the forefront of the decisions that are made and how sessions are planned and how, seasons are run, the better we're going to be.
Well, I'd like, just for the benefit of the listeners, I don't pay people to talk about Brian Smith being, brilliant, but they just bring it up all the time because he is. I'm like the world's #1 fan of Brian Smith.
Yeah. And I've also run into a lot of coaches who were, like Matthew Cameron, who's now CEO of Panthers. Like, he was my Jersey Flegg coach at the time, and he was from, that Brian Smith school. And, I've admired and watched, someone like Rowan Smith from afar and done a lot of professional development that he's been around. And like, I really respect, I guess, that coaching tree, because I think there's a lot of really good parts to pull out of that. But I'm certainly not all in that coaching philosophy, but there's certainly a lot of things that I've learnt in relation to fundamental skill that I've pulled out and I've certainly implemented into, my own style of coaching, that's for sure.
Yeah, he's I might have to try and get him on, actually. I've got his number. He's a very, especially in the UK, like the number of good coaches who've come into contact with him, and just everybody, I'm a total fanboy. So this isn't the Brian Smith podcast yet. Maybe I'll ring him up and see if I get him on. But there is something that you've sort of touched on there in the general, the skills versus tactics aspect, which I guess comes down similarly to the sort of whether you're playing to win or to develop kind of way. But so this is a debate massively in soccer, is that, everybody thinks that they're Pep Guardiola or Jurgen Klopp or somebody like that, even when they're coaching under 13s and they've got the kids trying to do, shape and stuff like that, you just think, well, just let them play, and develop their dribbling, passing, tackling, heading, whatever it is. And what my assumption would have been is that coming into, say, maths and ball at 16, 17, that's the bit when you start adding the tactic stuff, because you wouldn't want to overburden 15-year-olds with all that kind of stuff off from the off. And I wonder, at what point do you stop teaching predominantly skills and start teaching predominantly tactics, strategy, whatever you want to call it, in terms of collective aspects as opposed to individual aspects?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. Like, I've been in NRL clubs where it's limited skill and it's predominantly strategy and tactics. I've been in other clubs where it's been, probably 50-50, or even other clubs where it's been tilted the other way, like it's been more skill than tactics. I think at the junior level, how do you ask kids to implement tactics or strategies if they don't have the skills to do it? So I'm a firm believer that until we get into those competitive age groups, you should never have tactics. And even if we did have competitions, I think what we take away from players at that probably 13 to 18 age group is the ability to think for themselves. And a lot of the time, when they get to sort of SG Ball, Jersey Flegg level, they don't even understand what their own weapons are, because they've just been given such a rigid game plan or such a rigid structure that was for the coach's purpose or for that particular program's purpose, that they don't actually know what their strengths and weaknesses are within their game. And you then get to the point where they're getting into full-time training, you still haven't ironed out some of those creases. So I think, particularly during that level or during that period of development, it's like I think it should be 90% skill, like catch pass, dummy half passing, tackle, kick carry, what all of those just basic fundamental skills that players need to not only be successful but also play the game in a safe manner. And then from there, I think there should be a balance in relation to coaches giving tactics, but also challenging players within games to say, righto, I'm going to give you this scenario and then you go and work out what the tactic is and I'm going to help you on the back of that. Like sort of having players be able to solve issues without the coach having to overlook it and prescribe it almost, because I think we've almost created a sport which is, in some cases, as tactical and as strategic as, basketball or NFL, but with far less stoppages. And like some of the issues I think that we run into as coaches, particularly at, again, flag cup, NRL level, is that, you implement a game plan and a team comes out and they're able to solve that game plan. That from there, do the players have the ability to problem solve and then react and come up with a plan B themselves? And as coaches, do we teach the players, okay, we're going to run with this game plan and we're going to try this strategy. And if this strategy works, then sweet. But if that strategy doesn't work and they do this, what's our plan B? And I think a lot of that comes back to the fact that we've just created robots from 13s to 18s with a lot of that block, run into a certain point of the field and then we'll run a block shape. And it just doesn't actually teach the players how to identify strategy and tactics that, are applicable for that game and that moment and that certain point in time within a game. And yeah, that's something that, I'm pushing really hard at the moment with the guys that I'm coaching in relation to trying to be better as a coach in relation to not only giving a game plan, but and then talking about, okay, this is what happens if, they solve that element of the game plan. Here's our plan B, here's our plan C, and then trying to give them tools for them to be able to work it out. Because, I mean, if they're going to go to the next level, it can't be all prescribed and it can't all be the coach's tactics and strategies. And then I guess to answer the second half of your question, like the tactics and strategies for me are always in and around like what are the strengths of my players, what are the weaknesses of my players, and then my tactics and strategies have got to relate to their strengths, trying to bring out their strengths, and then trying to work out what the weaknesses of the opposition are and, attacking that with the strengths that I've got. Essentially, like I think that's nuts and bolts strategy. But, when you look at some of the junior school games or some of the junior rep games, it is just tactics and strategy gone mad to the point where you just got players out there almost mirroring each other in relation to the shapes that they're running, and there's no real thought in and around the tactics. And there's no real thought from the players, particularly in those key positions, at looking at where's the space. There could be a quick play the ball and the space is right in front of them, and they'll shift the ball out to the other side of the field without actually identifying where the space is and where they should actually run their play at that point in time. So again, that's a pretty deep response, but I think it's a pretty deep and complex question. Like we could go on with that one for hours as well. Upskill your players and then they'll have the ability to do more in relation to tactics and strategies. That would be my mindset and philosophy around it.
Yeah, I was just thinking there. I think what you see the very best players is the ability to know when to play in the structure and know when to do it themselves. If you look at, Nathan Cleary's the obvious example, but he's a master problem solver, and he just won a grand final by saying this thing that we've been doing isn't working, therefore we need to do something else. Whereas and I think that's all. You could probably think of about 6 halfbacks who do that, or not just halfbacks, but key position players, and it's something that you hear people talk about. They're overcoached these days, blah blah blah. When actually this is a coachable thing. It's not overcoached. It's that they haven't been coached the right thing, which is that you can.
Yeah, it's also putting them in environments and then not coaching them. help them, let them fail, and then bring them back to you and then talk through and show them, okay, so you decided to run this tactic. Why did you do that? Do you think it worked? No, it didn't. What do you think you could do next time? And actually, and then you're allowing them to see it and allowing them to come up with some of the answers themselves. I think a lot of the time we just want to give our players the answers, and I don't think that's always beneficial. Sometimes I need to, muck it up and work it out and fail and then come back and work out the answer themselves.
That's what lower grades are for, is that you get to make those mistakes before you get to the point where it actually,
Yeah, and like a lot of people, when I speak and sort of say, it's not about results and my job is to develop NRL players, like some people look at you like, really? You're not trying to win? It's like, well, yeah, absolutely we're trying to win. 100% we're trying to win. But that's not the sole focus and purpose of my week. My sole focus and purpose is putting the players in the best position to be picked in NRL and preparing them to perform that way in a game on the weekend that we would like to win. And the tactics and strategies around that are a little bit based on, what is best for projecting them into the NRL, and then a little bit of what's best for our team and a little bit of, what we think will work against the specific opposition that we're playing on that weekend.
Moving very much into the world of the New South Wales Cup, right? Because this is, I don't like to think we do any hot takes here, right? But we do like to be slightly tabloid where possible. So I want you to list me, firstly, your favourite, what I call the Reggie's battlers, and I think of Billy Magoulias is my favourite one. He's never really going to be an NRL player, but brilliant at that level. And I wonder maybe who your favourite guys like that to deal with have been, and how important those guys are in actually making younger players realise this is what you need to be to have a long time career in rugby league. Because I feel I think of every week I see South Sydney's Reggie's team and go, why is Yleen Buddy Gordon still in it? But there is a reason he's still in it, because he's teaching kids every single week. Or, Greg Eastwood's still playing third grade for Glebe. Those guys they're almost like living examples. And I wonder how important having that kind of character around the group is in general, in terms of bringing on players as sort of like a coach on the field with them.
Yeah, I think my favourite, I guess, reserve grader, and it's a guy who made his debut last year, would be Dean Madison. He was the guy who I had in that, the Mounties team, that were all guys that had sort of done pre-seasons and had been chewed up and spat out and were told, you certainly at that point in time weren't good enough to be an NRL top 30 or train and trial or development list. So, yeah, he was, in that mid-20s range, part-time footballer, working on the side, and then, had the ability that year to, we obviously achieved some good results, and he got an opportunity with Blacktown Manly, so got a little bit of full-time training, and then it just took off from there last year. He spent, I guess the first 10 or 11 weeks at New South Wales Cup level and was almost the best player on the field for that 3 or 4 month period, and then found himself at the back end of the year through a few injuries, given his NRL debut, and that was probably the best day for me as a coach, the most rewarding day as a coach, to think, well, I've had this guy for the last 18 months and I've tried to upskill him as much as I possibly could with the projection that, he wanted to play NRL, and to see him fulfill that was such a cool thing as a coach. It was really, really cool. And even though, him obviously playing NRL then hurt our cup team, but, I keep saying that even in the environment. Now, if NRL's going well, and we're a win for us is to be able to promote players up into the NRL and have them be competent first graders, not have them get up there and then not be ready and get chewed up and spat out and end up back in reserve grade. I think that's where you've got to look at your barometer for success. And I guess we even look at someone like Brad Schneider and Jack Cogger and, going back to Sean O'Sullivan, those guys who spent a lot of time in reserve grade and then were able to then kick on and play first grade somewhere else. Bit like Billy McGoulis is an unreal example. Like, we done a lot of preview on him last week, and then he didn't play, but like, he's
Disappointing those who turned up to Newtown to watch 3 chip chases in a half.
I've got to say, I was not disappointed to not see him on the team list, because he is a headache, and he is just such an old school, unorthodox, but yet very fast, mobile, skillful footballer, and he is very much not in vogue with a system, which is actually so dangerous when you put him in at that level. I think he had 8 offloads the week before, like, watching his game going, God, this guy is going to be a handful, particularly for us. Like, we've got a lot of guys who are first-year cup players who it's their first year playing against men, and then you're running into this guy who's so experienced and, you know, has seen it all at that level and just knows his way around a footy field. He's probably my favourite. Even like someone like a Beryl, who, you know, he went through and got 18th man on the weekend. I guess you're talking about guys who haven't played NRL, like Jake Toby. We had Jake Toby last year at Blacktown, and he's played a lot of reserve grade for Blacktown. He's now at Norths. I think he got a little bit of full-time training with the Melbourne Storm this last off season. There's a lot of guys bouncing around that level. Like, we had a guy named Josh Daly, who not a lot of people would know at Mounties, like an incredibly talented hooker. He went over and he's playing for Newcastle in, I think is it League One?
They were League One.
League One.
That's Jaden Burrow is a good example of that, and it works. There's all these guys who were just, they're in a weird zone. And we were actually talking about Jaden Burrow at the weekend, going, he's clearly too good for that level, but he's not quite, he's not quite the other one. And but they are, I think they're so vital.
But he's so important, important. Like, particularly at those clubs, the clubs that are not a direct NRL New South Wales Cup side. So like your Blacktowns, your Jets, when we were Mounties. Like, look at North Sydney. North Sydney are predominantly like filled with players who are that, part-time New South Wales Cup player. They are vital, but I think we need to look at a mechanism in relation to trying to strengthen our reserve grade by trying to keep those guys in and around footy. Like I had nothing to do with Canberra's New South Wales Cup last year, but like Jared Croker played probably half the year with the New South Wales Cup, and he's now doing a little bit of coaching on the side, like specialised coaching with the NRL and the Cup. And just the way that they speak about, our young players speak about the impact that he had on them, not only in relation to how cool is it to play with someone like that, but just how much he can develop a player as, like you say, a coach on the field and a coach at training who's got that respect because he's only just come out of the game. So I think trying to keep those guys in and around NRL systems in the New South Wales and Queensland Cup would be hugely beneficial, because I think it assists the development of those young players so much. Not so much technical, tactical, but it could just be, a little conversation here and there and a little tip here or there in relation to, something really specific, but it might also just be something really general or something that's happening personally. They are vital, absolutely vital. And we don't have enough of them in New South Wales and Queensland Cup. And, is that because we're trying to push players through flag and into that level probably quicker than what we have in the past? Yes. Is that completely beneficial? I don't know. I guess it's the old balancing act. I think there's a place for that player, and there's also a place for trying to, those guys that are a little bit too good for flag, trying to expose them to open age and playing against man is also beneficial as well. I think we've probably just got to find the balance.
So we have to end on the most tabloid question possible, which is, you've taught kids all across Western Sydney. Who were the ones who you thought at the age of 14 or 15, this kid is going to be an absolute world beater?
There's a few, probably going back to days at Penrith. Like the obvious two are Nathan Cleary and Jerome. You could tell early that they were going to be really super talented, and they they obviously went through and shot through the grades pretty quickly. There's one, like Moses Leota is one that, like, he was just super dominant, super hardworking, and had all those different attributes. There's one out at when I was out at West doing a little bit of coaching out at West, and I had the West Harold Matthews, and a young kid named Justin Matamua rolled up, and he was just so talented, such a nice kid, such a beautiful family. And I remember saying to someone there, like, if there is a God, like, this kid is going to kick on and play first grade. And I think he's made his debut. Like, he might have played a game or two, but probably hasn't played as much first grade as yet. But he's a guy who I think is super talented, and he's playing really well in New South Wales Cup so far for the West Magpies. Another one, like, I saw Blaze Talangi at a school carnival 3 years ago, and I was just like, this kid is going to be, he just looks like a first grader. He's jumping off the page as a first grader. So they're probably the ones that come to mind. Even someone like a Brendan Hands. Like, Brendan Hands was in that same team as Nathan and Jerome, but he was the year young. He was at St Dom's, and Brendan was actually a really talented basketball player. So he was playing, I think, either state or national level basketball at the same time as he was playing a little bit of Harold Matthews at that stage, and he was another kid who was just really, really talented.
Where Brendan Hands, the basketball player, fits in, because he's not tall. He must have been playing.
No, like, now you look at him and you go, yeah, like he was sort of that height at that age. Like, I just don't think he's grown too much. But there's like, going back to our discussion in and around junior development, like, he's national level basketballer, obviously very handy footballer, now a first grade footballer, so dual sport athletes, and not specialising and sampling and all that sort of argument. Like, he's one for that. Whereas a lot of kids in Western Sydney, they're just football. But I think actually, like, during my last couple of years PE teaching in Mount Druitt, like, there was a lot of those kids who love their footy. Like, they're now playing basketball at recess and lunch before they were probably playing touch footy. So that gives you a little bit of an insight. And I actually think it helps them, because it means that it's not everything's footy, and actually gives them different skills and movement patterns, jumping, all those different types of things that come into play in basketball, which I think will actually help, some of those kids in Western Sydney develop different skills and footwork and attributes that they can flow into their footy. They're their players.
You mentioned Sonny Luke there, and I hope Sonny, he's got Billy Magulia's foot hooker written all over him, and I hope he does. Not to say that Billy's not a great career, because he has, but like, Sonny playing in the NRL, you think this is, he's more of a purist player, right? He's got a pure footballer. You couldn't imagine him doing anything else. And like Billy Magoulias is, he's a rugby league player in a rugby league. If he wasn't a rugby player, he wouldn't be an athlete, And all of Sonny's skills are very soft skills, and I think, like, I hope he doesn't end up being the best player on the New South Wales Cup team, because
neither do I.
I hope he does way better.
He's too good for that level. Way too good for that level. But yeah, just such a really, really good human, and someone who's had to work extremely hard. Like, he sort of went out of Penrith. Like, he was in that NYC under 20s team with Cleary Luai, who won that comp in 2015 and then had to go away and played, he was playing Ron Massey Cup. Like, during COVID, he was at Ron Massey Cup level playing for St Mary's, and then, into New South Wales Cup and into some first grade. So, I'm with you. I hope he has a long career. It may be that he needs to go to Super League and he'll have a long career over in Super League. I'm not too sure, but super talented, you're right. And he does have so many of those little soft skills that, you wish you could give your hookers, particularly young hookers, if they could learn those soft skills. Yeah,
that's a good way to end it, the soft skills of rugby league. So thanks so much for your time, Brock. And it's good, as a Newtown Jets, tragic, it's good to have a second New South Wales Cup team, except for when they play Newtown League.
Well, you did say to me before the season, you did say that you're going to start 3-0 and then you're going to come to Newtown and get beat. So, I mean, you weren't far off.
Get beat. Yeah.
Well, I can tell you the players felt like they got beat. So,
When
Newtown, I think Newtown felt like they won, and we probably went away feeling like we'd lost, but a draw was a fair result.
Yeah, and when Puro put the kick wide, I thought it's bad that we didn't win, but it was the fair result. So I would say thanks so much for your time and such brilliant insights. I always forget to do this, but if you like this podcast, please do like, subscribe, share. Please actually tell somebody about it, because that is the best, all the best podcasts that I listen to, except for the wonderful Fifth and Last, which I found somehow on the internet 10 years ago, is because somebody told me about it. So please go and tell people about it, because if this is the sort of content you like, I'm sure you've got mates who would like it as well. Go and listen to Fifth and Last, which has been consistently, in my opinion, the best NRL podcast on a week-to-week basis since forever. I've been listening to it since at least... Do you know, I realise this? I've been listening to this since longer, before I met my partner, and we've been together over 8 years.
Yeah, we were 2013, I think was our first year.
Yeah, I was living in Berlin. I didn't have anyone to talk to footy about, and I felt like
I remember the first time we chatted, you were living in Berlin, I reckon.
Yeah, for the World Cup 20... wasn't the 2013 one, wasn't the 2017
It must have been 17, yeah.
Yeah, but there you go. And I was speaking to Lewis.
Thanks for having us on, man, and I'll come on whenever you want, because I love chatting footy with you. It's always a pleasure.
Brilliant, mate. Thanks so much, and I hope you enjoyed this week's Raw Rugby League podcast.